going live. This Hangout on Air is live. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Brooke Lester, and this is an OOTLE16 Hangout on Air. And with me today is Dr. Sara Koenig. Hi, Sara.
Hi, Brooke. Hi, everyone.
So Sara is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Seattle Pacific University. Sara, is that part of a department, or how does that work over there?
Oh, we are actually part of a school of theology. So we have various schools as part of the university. There's a school of psychology, and there's a school of health sciences, and we are our own school of theology, and then I'm in biblical studies within the school.
Gotcha. Okay. And by the way, congratulations on Associate Professor.
Oh, thank you.
How long ago did that happen now?
I think it was about 3 years now, 3 years. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good.
I feel like I should know more. I think it's one of those things like when my birthday, when I get into my 40s, it's hard for me to remember, past the monumental 40. It's like, oh, what year am I at? So.
Yeah. No, it's a big deal. And that's great news for those not who don't know that kind of inside baseball. Usually, if you are a full-time faculty person at all, and not, say, an affiliate or contingent faculty member like an adjunct instructor, then you probably start out as an assistant professor of something or another, and then eventually it is to be hoped become an associate professor of that thing, and then finally a full professor of that thing. And this is historically associated and sometimes and often still associated with, say, tenure and being on a tenure track and so on. So again, congratulations, Sara, on going for
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, just for people who are probably confused right now, although you are Sara Koenig, that's so sad. I was going to say, you're not the Sara Koenig. In my world, you are the Sara Koenig. And
well, thank you.
There's this other Sara Koenig who's come onto the scene in the last couple of 3 years because of the podcast Serial, right? So
exactly.
So there's the unfortunate news for anyone who's excited about hearing from Sara Koenig on the Bible. You are not the Sara Koenig of the podcast Serial. At the same time, I remember that you did a presentation at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature this last fall, where you played on your shared name, or nearly shared name, because she has an H in her, Sara, between you and Sara Koenig. What was that?
Well, it's true. I was trying to trade on the pronunciation, because Koenig is one of those last names that it's helpful because you can usually tell telemarketers, aside from the telltale silence when they call, usually they just mispronounce the last name. But Sara Koenig, the other Sara Koenig, does pronounce it in the same way, but she, like you said, does have an H with her first name, and I have no H. But I decided to trade on the name, and I did a presentation that was comparing Adnan Syed, who is the figure of the first season's podcast of Serial, someone who is accused of a murder. And the evidence is sort of iffy if he actually committed it or not. And so she spends the podcast trying to figure out, did he commit the murder? Did he not? And I compared Adnan Syed to Balaam in Numbers, because I think you have similar mixed evidence with Balaam. Is Balaam a prophet of the Lord, or is Balaam a seer who is going to pull the Israelites into idolatry? So I was trying to have fun with the name. And I did get this funny email. I don't know if I told you, Brooke, a couple of weeks before the conference where I was presenting this, I got a very excited email from a publisher who had to write me because he saw that my name was listed in the program doing a session on Serial and Balaam. And he said he actually looked me up to make sure that I wasn't the Sara Koenig. But then he was very excited that I was doing the presentation nonetheless. So I said, sorry to disappoint, but it should be an interesting talk if you want to come for the 25 minutes. I don't think he did, but he was still just a fan.
That's funny. I remember how taken I was at the time when you were talking about doing that, where, right, so because I feel like the comparison, and we talked about this, really cuts in many ways to the heart of some things that, as instructors of the Hebrew Bible, we find ourselves trying to get across to students about the nature of the material, right? So for example, so in your example with Balaam, who's mostly known right through Numbers 20 through to 24, but creeps in not only in that material, but also by virtue of the fact that his name sort of creeps in from time to time in other Old Testament material, we get this genuinely mixed or ambiguous or confused picture about what we're supposed to think about Balaam. Is he supposed to be, I guess that's in its most simple terms, is he supposed to be a good guy or a bad guy? And this is typical in many ways in the biblical literature. That is, even if you have some idea that someone's supposed to be a good guy, like Abraham, and then you start reading the material and you're like, wait, Abraham did what with his wife now? That doesn't sound like a good guy. Or you'll see a picture, you'll read about Saul, the king before David, and maybe come to the biblical material with some preconceived idea that Saul is the bad king because he did bad things or did things wrong, and he was rejected by God and replaced by David. And then you start reading the material, and he's often presented in a very positive light. He's a tall man and good looking and humble, and he makes a lot of really good decisions. And students, not always, but often, especially if they've got an idea that the biblical material is going to be simple and present simple morality tales, and that it should be easy for us to understand who is a good guy and who is a bad guy, or who is a, well, if it's a woman, it's almost always going to be a bad woman, right? Is you know, because again, biblical material. And then but then the material is so confounding, and in a similar way, serial sort of plays on, works with this idea, not only like that it's hard to understand whether Adnan Syed is a good guy or a bad guy, that is in legal terms, whether he's guilty or innocent, but this, that working with the evidence turns out to be a lot more complicated than those of us who don't live within the legal system might think that it is. Does that make sense? I mean, I muted myself because I was getting ready to ask you a question. Does that jibe with sort of, I mean, tell me, does that jibe with what some of your interest was around that presentation, or what else is there besides what I was just talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you use the term that it's typical, and when you were talking at first, I was going to say that's all the Bible does, is present us really mixed characters. And the other one who came to mind, which ties in with the section of text we're supposed to be talking about today, was Esau, who I think always gets such a bad rap. But Jacob is such a schmuck, and he's such a selfish and conniving guy. And Esau is the one who is really actually very generous with him, and it strikes me as really sad in Genesis. I think it's 30. Forgetting the text. 39 when they come back together after the wrestling. I think you're muted.
It's around 32 or 33, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
33 when they come back together, and then Esau wants to go with Jacob, and Jacob's like, no. But anyway, Esau's the really generous one there, but he's also mixed. And one of my students, I think, was quoting Brueggemann last year and talked about David being unapologetically human. And I find that as a great description of so many of the characters we encounter in the Bible. But yeah, your point about the evidence, that's one of the things that the other Sara Koenig found when she thought if she could have access to the evidence and the interviews, then she would be able to decide conclusively about Adnan Syed. And she said it's much more complicated. And I think that rings very true with what the Bible is. There's a lot more complication even when we're presented with the biblical evidence. And so trying to figure out what it means and how we read it, I find that's one of the most exciting things to me about the text.
Yeah, and that's going to come in, and we're going to be talking a little bit about biblical. We're going to be talking about biblical women together, obviously, because you've written on Bathsheba, and you're writing on the both of the Tamars these days, as well as Bathsheba. Um, and I think, not quite sure how fully formed this is in my head, but this idea that I'm still on the good guys and bad guys, where even sometimes where, and this goes to the old meant means distinction, right? The difference between what the Bible what biblical text may have meant in their time, and how they register with us and how we receive them. But that, like, even when the Bible is maybe trying to present someone in fairly flat terms as just a good guy, um, the ways that they do it, the norms and valuations by which they do this, just might not be ones that we share, right? So if David is presented as defeating the Moabites and then lining them up and like laying out a cord, and like, I can't remember how it goes exactly, but he lays out a cord so many times and these guys don't get killed, and then he lays out a cord and these guys get killed, right? He's basically decimating the Moabite warrior population. Probably a really good thing from the standpoint of the biblical text. This is David being a militarily victorious, strong leader and so on. But we as readers might add for us to an idea of seeing David as a very mixed figure, right? Because we just have other valuations around warfare. I wonder how that's going to play in with, or Abraham too, right? It's like, I don't know what the biblical writers of Genesis 12 and 20 might have wanted us to understand about Abraham passing his wife off as his sister. I tend to suspect that we're supposed to be pretty impressed at his wiles, and that, however that ends up playing out, that's supposed to be, or may have been intended to be, part of a positive picture of David. But for folks today, it's going to be, of Abraham, but for folks today, it's going to be a part of a very mixed figure. And I guess that's the kind of thing I'm going to, because also, I haven't thought about this with with our Bathshebas and our Tamars, but that's the kind of thing I want to be looking at too, is not only how does the material present more genuinely mixed portraitures of characters than a lot of folks might expect of the Bible, but how our perceptions of characters may be different. That part of how we see a mixed portraiture might sometimes be because we just don't share values in some important ways, or rhetorical turns might just go over differently with us than they do with maybe the original audiences.
Yeah, and what you're saying there is one of the reasons why I try to emphasize to my students as much as possible to pay attention to your own context and your own values, and recognize and articulate where they are at odds with the values of the social world of the Bible. And I was talking about this recently with the laws and the Old Testament laws about basically how your daughters are property. And I was saying that I have a daughter, she's 10 years old. I do not think of her as a piece of my property. And that may seem like a silly thing to do, but I just find that a lot of people can't even articulate, here's my value, or even with the sake of the biblical women, and we can talk about Tamar in Genesis, people get really hung up on the fact that she has sex with her father-in-law, and this becomes a good thing. And particularly if you're raised in a context where you're not to sleep with, sleep with people in this way, is this incest, it becomes bad. Am I muted? Okay. So yeah, I think just to be aware of what values am I bringing to the text, what assumptions am I making about what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. I think the Bible is much more complicated than this sort of flat picture than we often say.
No, I agree. And what I got excited about while you were talking about it, and this is, I wound up running to Google and looking something up, was, have you ever heard, Sarah, of what I know as the Gottwald, or Gottwald, I guess. It's the Gottwald you're thinking of, the Norman Gottwald. He's got a thing that he wrote. The attribution I'm seeing is a book called Reading from This Place, Volume 1, Social Location and Biblical Interpretation in the United States. It's 1995. And it's, I've heard it called the Gottwald Self-Inventory. And if you do a search on Gottwald inventory or Gottwald self-inventory, you'll probably end up finding a blog post at julieclawson.com. That's Clawson, C-L-A-W-S-O-N, julieclawson.com. The blog post titled "Self-Inventory on Biblical Hermeneutics," and she's basically working with with what Norman Gottwald has there, and that's the point of this self-inventory, is to first look at, like, what is my denominational history, to work out what is my actual working theology regarding the interpretation of the Bible. How does my ethnic history, culture, and consciousness influence my interpretation of the Bible? What about my gender history? What about my social class? What about my level of education? What about my community priorities, and so on, which I've used it a couple of times, and I really like it as a way of, as an overt way, as an explicit way of inviting learners to face off with these questions, so that, especially because it's hard for us to see a lot of the time, especially when we're new to this kind of thing, or even if we're not new to it and we're just not paying attention, right, to how my reading of a biblical text is a reading. And that I'm not just reading what the text says, that's an impossibility, that just all of these factors about my ethnicity and my community concerns and my denominational background and those presuppositions, how that is going to be affecting the way that I play the black marks on the white page, the way that the reading that I produce in engaging the text, in ways that I'm just probably not going to be aware of almost any of the time, unless some process or some other reader next to me can help me begin to see those, right? It's that old thing about that, well, bias by definition is what is invisible to me, right? And that these are the things that add up to my collection of biases.
And that sounds great. I don't think I've ever used that explicitly with students, but I think I should. And I try to ask them, yeah, what are you bringing to it? But I also, your comment about bias and how the person next to you can help you see it, I found that as much work as we can do ahead of time to say, where am I coming from? What do I think? Sometimes you don't even realize what you think until you're hit with one of these texts that says, oh, this actually resonates with me for good or for bad because of this experience I've had, or because of this belief I have, or because of my gender. And I think even as self-aware as we try to be, sometimes we need other people and we need the encounter with the text to kind of force us to think further about that and be confronted with it.
Yeah. All right, so Bathsheba, right? All of us wound up writing about something, right? And I mean, there's the question of how did you end up writing about the thing that you're writing about is often sort of a story in itself. Those of us who have done graduate school know that can often be a very personal story. But at the same time, we usually have some kind of elevator version of that story. But because you wrote about Bathsheba at the for your dissertation, right, as well, and are still writing about Bathsheba. I guess there's two ways to ask the question. There's how did you come to end up writing about Bathsheba? But then there's also the overlapping but not identical question of why Bathsheba? Why be interested in Bathsheba? Why be excited about Bathsheba? So let me just put it to you both ways at once and let you just kind of play with that however you want to. Let's just say, why Bathsheba?
And have I ever told you my elevator speech story?
No.
Okay, so I'll get to that in a second, but the question, why Bathsheba, I actually write about this in the book that's coming out next. One of my colleagues, I think she was trying to joke. I was telling her that I was working again on Bathsheba, and she said, and then you're going to come out with a book and you should title it Everything You Never Wanted to Know About Bathsheba. So, I'm sure people think that, but she was the one who said it most directly. And I thought, wow, that's a little insulting. But, granted. So my elevator speech, how I got into it was a seminar my last year of my PhD coursework on, I think it was on literary studies. Now I don't remember what the particular topic was, but we looked at a few of the narratives in depth. And the one that just made me so curious was 2 Samuel 11, and this is the chapter where David first encounters Bathsheba. And the thing that made me so interested in it was because there is such a lack of detail in the narrative, which is typical for the Hebrew narrative, but there's just no thoughts are ever mentioned, no feelings, no what's going on with these characters. And my thought at the time was maybe that's why people have such different readings of Bathsheba, everything from she's the seductress who is bathing naked in the open, so David will be tempted and will sleep with her, to she's the victim who, in the situation of the monarchy, how can you say no to the king? So I was really interested in that chapter. And then I had a conversation with Dr. Siao, and I said, I'd like to do my dissertation on 2 Samuel 11 and how it's been interpreted over the years. And he said, don't do it. He said, if you do that, you're going to have to look into how it was interpreted in the medieval period. And so you're going to have to learn medieval French in order to be able to do this for a dissertation. And he said, instead, look at Bathsheba, because no one ever looks at Bathsheba, you know, and then you're going to have a smaller amount of material to be able to control. So turns out, as often was the case, Dr. Siao was right and had some wisdom about this. And so because there's really not that much that is written about Bathsheba, it became a good topic for a dissertation because the material was manageable. Unlike if I had chosen to write about David, I would have had to read so much extra stuff. So that was my initial study, was what do the texts say about Bathsheba in particular, but then that was my dissertation. And since then, the work I'm continuing to do is reception history. How has Bathsheba been received, interpreted throughout time and in these different historical periods? So there's my elevator speech.
There's such a, I'm trying to get my mind wrapped around the words, but there's such a neat paradox going on there in the way that you describe it, where Bathsheba, as you say, she's in many ways a minor character. And not only is she a minor character, but and you'll say more about this, but it's not that she's not terribly active, but things happen to Bathsheba more than Bathsheba does things. And at least certainly in when we introduced her in chapter 11. And there's not, as is often the case with these biblical narratives, there's not a lot of explanatory material about what's going on in people's heads, for example. You know, we don't know really what Bathsheba thinks about things. At least we're not told by the narrator what she thinks about things, like being rounded up by David's minions and, you know, having sex, you know, having sex, about, you know, and so on. And partly the paradox I'm thinking of is like, that's where all this material comes from that Dr. Siao is waving you off of, right? That's why everyone from like the church fathers to the medievals to the reformers to, you know, in modern novels, that's why folks can't leave Bathsheba alone. And keep trying to make sense of things. What the narrative critics, right, and you've written about this, call filling in the gaps, right? We've got these gaps in our knowledge, so all this stuff has been produced to fill in those gaps. And Dr. Siao is waving you off of that because it's so unmanageable. But what he's pointing you back towards is to sit back in the problem that gets all this stuff rolling, right? To sit in the problem of these gaps. I just think that says something, for one thing, about people who are looking for topics, right? But how does that end up working out for you in practice? Like, what happens when you go back, when the reason there's so much voluminous material added onto the biblical text by all of these interpreters because of what's not in the biblical text, when Dr. Siao throws you back onto this spare, gap-ridden, terse biblical text, how do you wind up just not sitting in an insoluble problem?
That's a great question. I think if I understand your question, and maybe I'm just hearing what is behind the question or just answering what I want to, I think there's something sort of paradoxical about the fact that it's because Bathsheba, there's so little written about her, that I actually argue that she's not a flat character, she's more complex. So it's kind of the what we don't know that makes her so interesting to me. And so that's the reason that I kind of keep coming back to it, not only because I've been working on it for a while and there's it's a manageable focus, but to me, Bathsheba has been this really helpful lens for a whole lot of other bigger topics, but because I can focus it through her, because she's relatively small, then I can look at something like how is interpretation done in the medieval period, which is this massive topic, and you know, people have written volumes on it, but to just look at how is Bathsheba interpreted in the medieval period gives me a kind of a handle to hang on to that. But the other thing that I'm kind of thrown back onto this spareness of the text, one of the reasons why I still like talking about Bathsheba is because it reminds me of the narrative ethics of life, how the idea is that in narrative ethics, how we read is connected to our ethical practices of how we live, and scholars have written about this. But the piece about Bathsheba I appreciate is the fact that I'm only given this very little limited information about her, but I feel like that's actually very true for people I encounter in this world, you know, people I don't know as well. I'm given this very little information about them, and so what snap assumptions do I make? How do I fill in the gaps with, you know, I see someone and then I automatically make these assumptions about them. And because I've been working with this biblical character for so long, it actually has affected the way I think about the people, the human people, where there's gaps, how I'm less quick to jump in and fill in the gaps in only this particular way and say, well, maybe that person looks downcast because of this reason, or maybe someone cut me off on the freeway, not because they're a jerk, but because they're rushing to take someone to the hospital. And, you know, so just these little ways that we always are filling in gaps. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I did enjoy musing.
Yeah, no, it's that is really interesting. I know myself well enough. I like the part about the connection you make between filling in narrative gaps when we encounter a Bathsheba, for example, in the biblical text, and the phenomenon of first impressions. I'm very aware at how bad. I've got some specific examples that I always walk around with in my head of where I've had very clear to me first impressions of people that I've met that I've later had the opportunity to find out that I was 100% wrong in those first impressions. And it can be bracing and even unpleasant to investigate, like, okay, so what is it in me? What are the presuppositions and biases and prejudices that I'm walking around with that prompted me to fill the gap of this first impression with all of these usually negative attributes, right? That then prove later to be wrong, and just so, well, obviously with a Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba is normally not. Well, I mean, she's one of the biblical whores, right? I mean, she's one of these, you know, opportunistic, if nothing else, these opportunistic biblical women who, you know, it's usually put in terms of David's adultery with Bathsheba rather than David's rape of Bathsheba, for example, right? Yeah, I don't have. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, or what more I have to say about it. You know, what's your experience? So when you do look at this at this history of interpretation, right? And I guess I am thinking of history of interpretation at least as well. No, okay. So history of interpretation, me walking around. Okay, you say. What's the difference between history of interpretation and reception history? Recognizing that this is one of those questions that everybody ends up with someone else telling them they're wrong when they venture to make some kind of clean distinction between history of interpretation and reception history.
Yeah, I was just gonna, before moving on to that, say we're back to Gottwald's self-inventory, right? That we need to sort of be aware of what assumptions we're walking around with, so that when we see someone and we make the snap judgments about them, it's like, oh, it's because of that in my own life. But you're the one who pushed me to clarify what I meant by history of interpretation and reception history. I think the snarky answer would be that reception history is the more sexy term today, and that people like to use that more, and that it's sort of replaced history of interpretation because people often use that synonymously. The distinction that I see has to do with history of interpretation attempting to be slightly more neutral in saying, let's discuss the history of how the biblical text has been interpreted, but often has, so it attempts to be neutral, but it can often have this very particular idea of there is a right way to interpret the text, and we're going to look at the history of interpretation of how everyone has gotten it wrong in the past. And I think you may remember the guy I quoted. I should maybe pull up a quote. He was hilarious because he was talking about how, you know, it's such this gloomy endeavor to do the history of interpretation and see how bad people do it over time, and they're completely wrong, and I, of course, am right and know how to interpret right. So, so I think it tries to be neutral, but then also assumes that there's a right way. That's what I see in history of interpretation. Whereas reception history seems to, because of its title, talk about the text has been received by some readers, and so then inherently pays a little bit more attention to who is doing the receiving. And some people critique it because they feel like reception is a more passive term, like I'm just receiving instead of I'm, I don't know, maybe I'll throw out football here. I'm receiving the ball instead of I'm catching the ball actively. But I don't know that it has to be passive. And then this is something that, again, Dr. Seo talks about. He refers to it as a history of consequences. And so he's got his own term, but one of the aspects of that I think reception history can get into is that whenever we receive the text and then do something with it, there's some consequences for it. So, you know, the reception of Bathsheba as a seductress may have consequences for women who have been sexually assaulted by people in power. And to say that if we just blame her for it, even the way we talk about it, could have really negative consequences for women who today are in that situation. So did that kind of answer?
Yeah, it does. When you talk about like catching and receiving, right, and the connotations of passivity, right? History of interpretation is the history of active men, mostly, sitting down and interpreting something. And then we'll talk about how they were wrong because they're you know, we think they're saying things in the text that aren't there or whatever. But at least they're active. And reception history can sound passive because it's the history of the ways that the text has affected the culture and the artifacts of that culture. You can think of like medieval passion plays with regard to the Gospels, for example, or Veggie Tales, right, with regard to particular biblical stories, or some of the novels, you know, that you've been looking at that embrace the Bathsheba. Well, I guess embrace, right? Reception as embrace. If you think about what is a reception like with punch, you know, and so on. You know, you're receiving a guest. But you're not just receiving the guest in some passive way, you're creating a context in which to receive the guest, and you're creating and that context involves lenses and understandings and things that you want to happen as a result. I know that sounds very abstract. Okay, so Bathsheba and the history of reception, the Veggie Tales, right? So how is Bathsheba received into the Veggie Tale stories of David, and maybe that'll give us a little bit of an idea of history of interpretation and reception history as different ways of understanding what's going on there.
Yeah, well, anyone who's seen it, it's King George and the Ducky, and so King David is King George, and he has all these rubber ducks, and he loves to take his bath. Oh yes, I love my duck. And so he's singing about how he some kings are doing things that are yucky, but I want to bathe because I love my ducky. And so, so you know, if you press that, then Bathsheba is received as a rubber duck. She is an inanimate object, an object of desire. And one of the things that you know, how does that objectify her? And another piece of this project has been so interesting to me to think about, well, what's the audience this is for? You know, this is for ostensibly for small children. And so to talk about sex and adultery and taking women, maybe not appropriate in that setting, but yeah, to objectify her, but then also to trace how that has happened previously before VeggieTales, that she becomes really objectified during the Reformation. And when she is not described as a person very much, she's really just described as the object of David's sin. And therefore she could even be, because the main point isn't about her, it's about David as the consummate paradigmatic sinner who is then forgiven by God, like all humans are. But then she could have been a silver candlestick that is stolen, you know, that she doesn't have to be a person in that way. And so that trend of receiving her as an object kind of trace out some of the connections between that. And I haven't seen History of Interpretation doing quite as much comparative work, so that might be another distinction between reception history in that way.
Yeah. We're both sitting here thinking, okay, so I'm afraid I'm going to get all hung up trying to untangle reception history. So how about instead, right? Because no, I see, like, so Bathsheba, I'm just interested that I'm just kind of what's stopping me in my tracks there is this idea that, like, there's this long history of interpretation of the David and Bathsheba story revolving around, and we can see the different concerns of the interpreters. And you talk about that the reformers you describe as being particularly hung up on the stories about David as the paradigmatic sinner. And with the story about David as the paradigmatic sinner, it's sort of inevitable that Bathsheba is relegated to an object of David's desire. And as you say, she might as well be a silver candlestick. And how that, combined with the context of VeggieTales, where they're trying to get across ideas to children, and so a sexualized, person is not going to fit the needed context. For that reason, the Bathsheba story sort of, the VeggieTales David story readily receives that history of interpretation, that part of the history of interpretation that sees Bathsheba in these ways, over against, for example, as you talk about in your dissertation and in your book, about the relatively positive version understanding of Bathsheba, where she, in some lines of interpretation, is understood to be paradigmatic of the church, right? Is that right? Where David is a figure of the Christ, and Bathsheba is a figure of the church, and this very anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic view in which Bathsheba, say more about Bathsheba, is basically saved from her existing marriage and received into David as the Christ. How does that go again?
Yeah, it can get really ugly and really awful. So the idea is this happened in the patristic period, when they tend to allegorize all sorts of things, and pretty much every character in the Old Testament becomes a figure of Jesus, which is really interesting, the sort of hermeneutical fancy footwork you have to do to sustain that. But the one that you're talking about is that David is a figure of Christ, which happens a lot. But then Bathsheba is David's wife eventually. And so therefore, who is the wife or the bride of Christ? Well, it's the church. But Bathsheba was married before to Uriah. So then who was the church married to before? And not every allegory presses it this far, but a couple of them say, well, Uriah represents the devil. And so Bathsheba is, when David sees her bathing, that represents the bath of baptism that washes her pure from the grime of the previous marriage. And Jesus kills the devil to bring the church to his own, which, that one's not quite as bad. But for other ones, Uriah then represents the Jews or the synagogue. And so there's one where it says, Christ has to kill the Jews or kill the synagogue to take this wife to himself. So depending on how many of the details of the narrative you're willing to incorporate into your allegory, it gets horribly, egregiously anti-Judaic, where therefore, Christ kills the Jews in order to marry Bathsheba. Therefore, and we just have to glance at Christian-Jewish relationships in history and see how terrible the implications or the consequences of such a reception would be. So that reception isn't neutral, which I think is a piece of the terminology of reception history, which, you could do a history of something awful, like a history of abuse, and you just describe what's happened over time. And I suppose no historian who does that work wouldn't be concerned with the implications of that. But at the same time, to use the language of reception history seems to be inherently talking about some of the implications that it has for our readings.
Yeah, reception history. That's the difference you were talking about between history of interpretation and reception history before that. So, for example, in that patristic reading of Bathsheba as a figure of the church being received by David as the Christ and saved from the devil / Judaism and all that goes with that, it's like in a history of interpretation, at least in the way that certainly I was formed, where, when you're trying to explicate the biblical text to hearers today, whether it's a classroom or in a congregation, in a sermon, or whatever kind of preaching or teaching is going on, the idea is that we are trying to bring them back to the text. And in order to do that, we have to separate the wheat from the chaff because what people are walking around with is the sum total of however their ethnicity, communities, their culture has received not only the biblical text, but whatever collection of connotations for Bathsheba they have received from the patristics, from the reformers, from others, and this all has to be rooted out and thrown away, right, in order to bring people back to the original pure biblical text, over against reception history, which is going to is going to look at, say, the patristics and say, how did this line of interpretation or this reception function for the patristics, for the patristic writers? What good did it do? What problems did it solve that they were walking around with and trying to do their Christologies, for example? And so on with each community of receivers, up until today. What about, so that would bring us all the way up to, I wanted to make sure I asked you about this, so I don't want to forget while we're talking Bathsheba. What about the novelists, right? You've come across a number of modern novelists who are overt, in pretty direct ways, receiving the David and Bathsheba story. And so, as reception historian, as history of interpretation people, we need to find out where they're wrong about the biblical text and how they're seeing things that aren't there or whatever, and we're going to judge them in that way. But as reception historians, we are going to be asking other questions, right? Like, how are they receiving the text, and what connotations are they selecting from this whole snowball that's been building up over the last, a couple thousand odd years, and how might so what are you finding in the novelists first?
Yeah, and thanks for that nice tee up. That's my presentation this year at the annual SBL, so no more Sara Koenig serial stuff, but yeah, the novelists on Bathsheba are so interesting. We don't know what Bathsheba's thinking or feelings, but these novelists just fill in those gaps big and deep, and have long soliloquies of this is going through her head. And you've got an interesting range of, even depending on the subgenre of the novel. So there's this subgenre of Christian fiction. And for those, they actually cannot make David too bad, because then the story becomes really awful if he is abusive or painful in some way. Instead, they turn it into sort of a bodice ripper type, where they have descriptions of Bathsheba's feels the heat rising in her body when David looks at her, and it's sort of this scintillating, definitely PG rated, nothing too detailed here, but when his lips touch hers, her breath stops for a second. And so it becomes this kind of love story. And she could be conflicted in there, but so they'll give a lot more feeling and emotion to that. So there's that subgenre. The Christian novelists, you have other novelists who do some really interesting kind of odd things with it. Joseph Heller wrote a novel in the 70s called God Knows, and his Bathsheba is really wanton and sexual and crude, and that's an interesting one because she basically is a whore in that one, and yet his serious note is he asks some really serious questions about how can God kill the child that is of Bathsheba and David. So there's that one. But then the more recent trend that I've seen, and the novels that have come out in the last 2 to 3 years, and I think it's as recent as that, they actually put the possibility that, or not a possibility, they receive it as that Bathsheba is raped by David. And the most recent novel that I've seen was written by Geraldine Brooks, and it came out in 2015. And there it's very explicit. It's written from Nathan's point of view, but Nathan is talking to Bathsheba, and Bathsheba talks about the bruises that are left on her arms after David took her and slept with her. And so to see that possibility that this isn't adultery, this is rape, is something that you see more generally in reception, not just in the novelists, but a couple of recent articles and books that have come out have said that. But it's interesting to see that has become more aware, and I wonder if that's a piece of our own interest in our society where we don't have a clear definition of rape legally, and we need to talk more about this, and sexual violence continues to happen. So that would be an example of reception history.
Especially I hear especially in the first example that you gave with the like Harlequin romancy, bodice ripping, her breath stops, kind of thing. But through those, I kind of sort of hear, something like Christian communities of certain stripes, right? Like, whether you self-identify as evangelical or mainstream, or whatever, but different Christian communities trying to work through issues around gender roles, especially male dominance as a normative feature of gender roles in marriage, and the resulting problems around consent. Right? You can go to web pages about Christian marriage, where you'll see disagreements about whether wives even have the right to say no to sex, right? And claims that rape is impossible in marriage by definition because the woman belongs to the man sexually, or counterclaims that it's not so simple, and so on. And I sort of hear that the David and Bathsheba story becomes one means by which to narratively try to work through questions around male dominance, patriarchy, and consent.
Yeah, and I think it's a really serious issue. And so that's, I think, where the consequences for the interpretations that we've given to this text, we should look at those squarely and say, how has our reception of this been harmful and painful for people as well? I did want to throw out another name of a scholar. I know I talked about Dr. Seale a couple times. Brennan Breed is someone who I think has some really great insight into reception history, and he's drawing on some of Deleuze's theories. Are you pulling out the book for show and tell?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a great book. He's got some great metaphors in it, but just talking about what does it mean to do reception history. And actually, to your point earlier, Breed argues that there is no pure text that hasn't been received. And so he talks about, the sources in Genesis. He says, well, the flood story, well, which is it? One community may have received that Noah's got 7 of every kind of animal, but then another one says it's 2 of every kind. And so just to see, we can actually, the text itself, the biblical text, is a reception of these histories and compositions. So it's basically all reception all the way down.
Yeah, and the way that it is, like turtles all the way down, right? That it's reception all the way down, it's turtles all the way down, and so even where we would talk about the composition history of a text, like say of the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, and a usual JEDP Pentateuchal composition history will look at a J stratum, an E stratum, and a priestly stratum. But what is the priestly stratum except a reception of the earlier JE material, right? Looked at this way, and that is any distinction that we make between a stable final text and later reception history. Brennan, I think, does a really good job of articulating and demonstrating and sort of working through the consequences of that these are always going to be artificial lines in a calendar that communities make. In this case, for denominate, these are I'm not sure, I don't know what the right word to use is, but these are religious communities are drawing these lines in the calendar. And removing that, it's reception. It's reception all the way back. I want to spend some time on. I was telling someone else that I want to spend some time on Brennan Breed this summer. I've done my first read through where I just get really excited about things, but don't really have a coherent, comprehensive picture of what I think is going on there and how I engage it. So but it's definitely worth a second run through to sort of to follow through in that way. There's a lot of folks reading nomadic text these days and talking about it, and that's as it should be. It's good. I mean, it's definitely worth that, and I'm in the middle of my process on that. I want to so yeah, this summer.
Nice. And also read, if you haven't already, Nyesha Jr. and Jeremy Skipper's critiques of it too, because I think they've got some really helpful places where he might be a little overly optimistic about the nature of texts moving without paying attention to the biases of the interpreters, and Nyesha Jr. in particular calls him out on that. So I want
something that I think, I can't remember if it was Nyesha who brought up this possibility, or possibly Amy Erickson or someone else. I'm losing track of my conversations. But someone's brought up the possibility of putting together like a multi-person Google Hangout this summer, where we just kind of take an hour or 90 minutes and maybe 6 or 7 or even 8 of us just sit down and do Brennan Breed's nomadic text,
nice.
On once in a while. So let's follow up on that. I think that sounds like a really great idea.
Yeah. Would we invite him to?
We should. I mean, I think so. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. Probably. There's no reason not to.
It's true.
Yeah.
We could do some authorial intent conversations with him too. So.
Okay. So anyway, what else were you were starting to say something before?
I was actually going to show you another picture of, the other thing I appreciate about reception history, your question about novelists came in, is that it allows us to look at some of the other genres through which the Bible is interpreted, and particularly, Veggie Tales, movies, novels, but also art. And so I have a picture which is a little bit more maybe R-rated, PG-13. And this is one from I don't know if you can see it. Can you see? So there, this is from a book of hours that was done in medieval France. And here Bathsheba is bathing naked, really kind of openly naked. And there she is. And there's David in the corner watching her, but like her head is tilted to the side, like she knows he's looking at her. And so I think the way that reception history asks us to attend to, when I read this text, what pictures have I seen? What images have I seen that I'm bringing with me? And we've all, I think, often acknowledged that none of us come to the Bible with a blank slate or as a blank slate. But then I think reception history, I appreciate the way that it says, when did I last see the Prince of Egypt? And how much is that movie playing in my mind when I'm reading what the text actually says about who Moses is, or how Moses got sent down the Nile, because the text actually says he's put in in the reeds there, he's not like sent off the Nile and encounters a crocodile and a hippo, but I think we bring the reception even in our own experience to the text. And so to say, oh, when I'm reading it, I've got all this other stuff that is coming with me. So maybe to add that into Gottwald's inventory in some way, to say, you know, what movies or pieces of art or books, picture books have you read, and how does that affect your interpretation of this?
All right, so another, I know we're getting close to an hour. Another very close to the Bathsheba story, almost in some ways as a follow-up to it, there's the story of the rape of Tamar. There, more clearly what folks through history would have called rape, you know, even more so than the Bathsheba story, and raped furthermore by her brother or her half brother. And you're doing some work now on not only that Tamar, right? The Tamar in 2 Samuel, who in this sort of next generation after and only two or three chapters after the Bathsheba story, and in that next generation where this rape happens and its consequences in this sort of dynastic family. At this point, it really feels like we're watching Dallas or something like that, you know. And then there's, of course, there's the earlier Tamar, the Tamar of Genesis, who has the same name but a different story. And you're doing some work now on these, but where sex and sexuality and having sex is at the center of that story. Just as rape, sexual violence is at the center of the other Tamar story. Just briefly, so folks know what you know. I know it's hard to say anything briefly about it, otherwise you wouldn't be writing this big thing. But what are you doing right now? What's your interest in the two Tamars, and what do you find yourself doing with the two Tamars?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The work is actually for a piece that my regional Hebrew Bible group of the Society of Biblical Literature, we're putting out a volume on clothing in the Hebrew Bible, because there's not really much that's done with that. So when that was invited, ideas about clothing in the Hebrew Bible, I actually thought of both of the Tamars, because in both of their stories, there's something about their garments. So in Genesis, the Genesis one, Tamar, she's wearing the garments of widowhood, but she takes off her widow's garments, puts on a veil, and then that's when Judah sees her and thinks she's a prostitute, ends up having sex with her. She gets impregnated by Judah and then ends up bearing twins. And then after their sexual encounter, she takes off the veil and puts back on her garments of widowhood. And then the clothing is less of a role in 2 Samuel 13, but we're told there that the 2 Samuel Tamar had been wearing this garment. It's exactly the same terms that is used for Joseph's coat of many colors in Genesis 37, and in Genesis in 2 Samuel 13, this ketonet kasim is described as the clothing that's worn by the virgin daughters of the king. And after she's raped, Tamar rips her clothes. And a lot of people have understood that as just a symbol of grief, because in the Hebrew Bible, when you're mourning, when you're grieving, you tear your garments. But I'm trying to argue that it's more symbolic than that she's tearing this garment that was symbolic of her royalty and of her virginity. And after the rape, she's no longer a virgin. But I'm trying to argue that she's no longer part of this monarchic structure that maybe should have protected her and did not in that way. So clothing is the insight, but it is interesting to see how similar the stories are, in addition to the names that the characters share, just the themes of patriarchy and oppression and sexuality. And some people have argued there's almost an inverse, where in Tamar in 2 Samuel, she's so violated and abused, and in Genesis, she kind of takes control of her sexuality. And there's an article by Fauquelin Van Jek Hems, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, that argues that the Genesis Tamar is sort of a midrash on the 2 Samuel Tamar. So that's what initially got me interested, but the clothing and then the way that these women are using their garments to enact kind of what's happening to them is what I'm been doing with that.
It's interesting where, like, if the Tamar of Genesis is in some way a response to, whether midrashic or what have you, a response to the Genesis, the Tamar of 2 Samuel, there's almost like a, if not really a rehabilitation, but I guess a vindication. There almost feels like there's some kind of vindicatory opportunity being offered there, where the Tamar who undergoes sexual violence in 2 Samuel and is by no means passive in that sense, because she cries out, she attempts to be active, to talk her abuser down, but ultimately unsuccessfully. And whereas then the Tamar who's imagined in Genesis, in this, not only does she get to use her sexuality in this much more active and self-serving way, right? That is, that is, she's being mistreated sexually, right, by Onan, who continually uses her sexually, but without impregnating her, in the way that he's supposed to. And she uses her sexuality and deception, and is overtly lauded by the text, right? Judah himself in the text of Genesis says, "She has been more righteous than I have. She is the one who is right." In a way that to me is reminiscent also of the Ruth story, right? Where Ruth appears to transgress sexual norms in a pretty direct way by staking out this well-fed and perhaps drunken dude in a private place on the threshing floor, and is rewarded with a place in David's genealogy. So you've got, I sort of see this, we've got the Bathsheba and the Tamar, who are violated sexually, and then you have these other two women who are able to use their sexuality, not only use their sexuality in such a way as to see to their own interests and those of their families, but are overtly rewarded for this by the text.
I got excited. I forgot to unmute. And it's interesting that for Ruth, she is described as an Eshet Chayil after this thing with Boaz, so it's like after he wakes up and is surprised.
Yeah. Translated a woman of worth, or
woman of valor.
Woman of valor, yeah.
It's the same description that you get for the Proverbs 31 woman, which some people argue is an actual human, and other people say, no, that's actually woman wisdom. But Ruth's she's the only human character who gets described in that way, yes, as an Eshet Chayil. And so to say that it's after this transgression of these sexual boundaries that she is praised for this. And yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, that these, whenever I delve into the narratives, I just see I can't sustain a really simplistic or flat reading of what is good and what is bad in it.
And so we come around to the thing that we always end up coming around to, which is that the Bible that everybody goes to looking for answers all the time, that it's just this inherent part of it's a big idea that we keep trying to bring to readers of the Bible, that the Bible seems to be much more interested. It's not that the Bible never wants to tell us what to think. It certainly does. Biblical texts do want to tell us what to think, but very, very, very often biblical texts are also trying to pull up the way we think and challenge the way we think, and to present things as complicated, maybe not entirely without the goal of getting us to think a certain thing or think a certain way, but the means by which it gets to that is by getting us to think, right? By prompting us to think.
Yeah, and even the narratives that have all these gaps, I argue that the gaps are an invitation for us to participate in the meaning-making process. And so, I tend to think if the Bible wanted me to think in a really simplistic way, Bathsheba was a seductress. I think the authors could have said that. I think they could have gotten that across. But the fact that they don't, and instead they present this really gapped character, I think they want me to bring myself to it and to say, well, what do I think and how do I make meaning out of it? So I see, in general, the Bible is this big invitation to participate in the process of making meaning.
That's good. Okay, so for folks who want to go read some Sara Koenig, there's Isn't This Bathsheba, right? A Study in Characterization is the subtitle, and that's in the Princeton Theological Monograph series, and that was 2011. So for more on for more on Bathsheba from you, Sara, that's what people can look for. Isn't This Bathsheba? And you also did a thing. I'm just reminded this. You have an essay in a book about U2, that is the musical band U2, called Exploring U2, Is This Rock and Roll? Essays on the music, work, and influence of U2. And you've got, was this a collaborative piece with Jeffrey, is it Coos?
Coos, yeah.
Coos.
Like Seuss with a K is what he says. But yeah, this was not biblical studies per se. It was I'm kind of a wannabe philosopher. I'm not smart enough to be a philosopher, but the continental philosophers I really appreciate. So this is a piece where we were looking at U2's music through the lens of Paul Ricoeur. And so how does Ricoeur understand selfhood and the self's relationship to another, and how do we see that in some of the lyrics of U2? Yeah. Good. And then I came out, I guess just this last year, there's a piece on David's hegemonic masculinity, and that's in biblical interpretation. And it's an article in there that talks about the way that David exercises his hegemonic masculinity vis-a-vis Bathsheba, Uriah, and Joab in that.
Okay, good. Yeah, I remember you working on the hegemonic masculinity piece. Where's that going to be found again?
It is the, oh man, this is embarrassing that I don't have it off the top of my head. Let me check real quick. It is.
While Sara's digging that up, folks can also go to workingpreacher.org and do a search for Sara Koenig's name and find some of your stuff there as well.
Yeah, it's not coming up. Hold on. Oh, because I'm looking in the wrong place. You could just look for, the title is Make War Not Love, because that's kind of what it's about. It's not, David is a hegemonic man, it's all about warring and not about loving and loving women. But then also, what are some of the assumptions that we're bringing to the understandings of men and women, and what is masculinity and those sorts of things. It is in, the journal is Biblical Interpretation, and this was a 2015 article.
Excellent. Good. Thanks, Sara.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks.
Thanks for spending some time with me today, Sara.
Yeah.
I always just love talking with you about all this stuff so much. I feel like we just
likewise.
Go on and on. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Good. So, as I've said, Sara is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Seattle Pacific University, and is going to, besides the things we've talked about that you've written, you're going to be presenting on Tamar and Tamar at the Society of Biblical Literature this year. Is that right? No, no, that's the Tamar and Tamar is from a session that you already did.
Yeah,
where's that going to be published? How's that going to be done?
We haven't done it quite yet. It's my regional, so the Pacific Northwest Regional Society of Biblical Literature. We're collecting together articles for a volume that I think we've got a couple publishers interested. That hasn't been out yet.
Okay, so that's still getting worked out.
Yeah, and then I'll be talking about Bathsheba and the novels this year in San Antonio.
That's right.
That's
okay,
real.
good.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, until next time we talk, Sara, thanks again very, very much. And thanks to folks for listening. I see a couple of my students hanging out, watching us as viewers right now. So to a shout out to Mr. Schroyer and Mr. Thompson. And good. All right, Sara, until next time.
Right.
Thanks. Sara, stick around and I'll say goodbye to you properly after we start the broadcast here.
Sounds good. Thanks
folks for watching both now and later.